This is Unit 5, PowerPoint 1, Railroads and the American West. Start off with a few big picture ideas. The first thing is that even after the Civil War in 1876, roughly right at the end of Reconstruction, the vast majority of Americans lived east of the 98th meridian, the 98th meridian being the line that bisects the United States, cuts it in half. What we're going to see, though, is a very quick settling of the western part of the country in the last 2 decades of the 1800s. A couple of other big picture items. At the end of the Civil War, the United States was still primarily agricultural. At the end of 1900, the United States was clearly an industrial power. And something that kind of goes along with that, after the Civil War, the country was still primarily a rural country. In 1900, the United States was much more urban. Crucial to pretty much everything in this unit are the railroads. Industry is going to be a huge topic of ours after the Civil War, and the railroads were the most important industry in the Gilded Age. I want to kind of touch upon 3 impacts of the railroad. First of all, they're vital to the economy, and they're going to open up internal markets. They're going to create jobs. They're going to allow people to move west. They're going to allow raw materials from different parts of the country to be shipped to the east. They do allow people to move west, particularly farmers. We have this image of most people moving west on kind of Conestoga wagons. And that was certainly true in the 1840s and the 1850s. If you ever played the game Oregon Trail, that's the kind of image you might have. But truthfully, most people moved west after the Civil War, after the advent of railroads. Right at the very bottom there, Native Americans, they're the big losers. The more we expand west, the more railroads encroach on Native Americans, particularly in the Great Plains. We have to think about the role of the federal government here, especially with railroads. I just want to kind of revisit some earlier things we talked about. If you remember, when we talked about when we were in Unit 3, we talked about how the states had kind of passed laws. So this is before Jackson. The states had passed laws that were designed to encourage capitalism. And this obviously happened in the northern states. And the way we talked about this, we talked about how after the Revolutionary War, different versions of republicanism were around. And in the northern states, to some people, republicanism equaled capitalism. So we call this the Commonwealth system in the early 1800s. So states would pass laws that were designed to charter, for example, companies who built roads, companies who built canals, that kind of thing. Remember, there was a big struggle throughout the early 1800s up through in Jackson's presidency, where people like Henry Clay wanted the national government to fund roads and canals, and we called this the American system. By the time we get to Jackson in the 1830s, the 1840s, 50s, and the late 1860s, we have a time period that people call classic liberalism. And this is where, like Jackson, very much like Jackson, The theory was just leave the economy alone and not get involved. So in the early 1800s, we see states pass lots of laws that give companies special rights and privileges. And that is kind of undone by people like Jackson and people after Jackson. This changes with two huge acts during the Civil War. The first one, the Homestead Act, the second one, the Pacific Railroad Act. And both of these acts involve the United States government getting involved in the economy and kind of shaping the economy. And they're definitely a move away from classic liberalism. The Homestead Act was the government setting aside 160-acre plots of land out west, primarily in the Great Plains. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 chartered two companies to build the first transcontinental railroad, and we'll be talking about this in some detail. So when we talk about the West, it kind of means different things at different time periods. When we talk about Manifest Destiny, the West actually kind of meant the far West, the Pacific West. And so in the 1840s and 50s, there were several trails that were developed. And of course, when we talked in the 1850s, California and Oregon were the places that were settled. The Great Plains was pretty much skipped over. And that was because at the time it was thought to be entirely worthless, the Great American Desert. If you cast your mind back, this is why we put Native Americans there in Jackson's presidency, right? I mean, Jackson removed Native Americans from the east and put them out west, and the United States government put them in an area, the Great Plains, that they thought white people would never want to go to. Here's another map, and what this shows is by 1887, the American dream of having railroads that go across the continent had largely been realized. In the 1850s, remember, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we had talked about having a transcontinental railroad. You can see by 1887 there are actually 4 different rail lines that go from east to west. When we talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, the first one, if we look at this map from the previous slide, I've highlighted the first Transcontinental Railroad. Now you can see it actually ends in Nebraska. And it starts in Sacramento, California. So it doesn't quite go across the country, and the reason for that is that there were already railroad lines that had been built in the eastern part of the country. So the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 is going to charter 2 companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. The Union Pacific is tasked with building the railroad west, starting in Nebraska and building west. The Central Pacific is tasked with starting in Sacramento and building east. Now you can see that it's kind of uneven. It looks like the Union Pacific pretty much covered 1/3 more ground than the Central Pacific. And the reason for this should be obvious to you. There is a geographical reality in the western part of the United States that the Central Pacific had to deal with. Now, railroads are incredibly important to the industrial development of the United States after the Civil War. One of the biggest ways they're important is the fact that they cost so much money and they were so big. The Union and the Central Pacific companies were huge companies. In fact, railroads are our first modern corporations of any real size. To offset the cost of building these, the government felt that it had to kind of offer incentives to investors. There was a great deal of risk involved in building railroads, and The government came up with two ways to make this quite an attractive proposition, and this is definitely not laissez-faire. So when we talk about classic liberalism of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, we're talking primarily about a government that was fairly laissez-faire and didn't really get involved. After the Civil War, in some ways the government is still laissez-faire, but not when you're talking about railroads. The government gets quite involved with railroads. So there's two ways that the government is going to get involved here. One is to give land to each of the companies. So for every mile of railroad track laid, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific received land. They could do whatever they wanted with that land. And it made them very powerful, and it made them even wealthier than they were. The government also gave both companies access to loans at a very, very reasonable interest rate. This map is a slightly different one, but it shows you the area that was given to railroad companies. And it might not look very impressive when you separate it out, but if you add it all together, the government gave 1.3 million acres of land to different companies from 1850 to 1871. That is roughly an area the size of Colorado. The Union Pacific gets an early start during the Civil War, but it's mainly after the Civil War in 1866 when the Union Pacific really picks up pace. A former general is put in charge of the work there. The main workers on the Union Pacific are Irish immigrants. There are also some Hispanic migrant workers. There are also some former slaves, but primarily we're talking about Irish immigrants working on the Union Pacific line. The big problem that the Union Pacific has is that it is building right through the Great Plains, and there's an area owned by several fierce Native American tribes who, by this point in their existence, seem to be fighting for their very survival. And the big problem that the Union Pacific has is Native Americans are going to attack it, particularly the Sioux tribe. Finally, the Union Pacific solves this by actually having the military guard their workers. The Central Pacific has a quite different problem. The Central Pacific, if you remember, is the company that built from the west, from Sacramento, California, and they built eastwards. You can see that they were the big four. The most famous one, of course, is Leland Stanford, because he left a lot of money. Like a lot of wealthy men in the country after the Civil War, he's going to make his money on the railroads. And he's going to leave a big chunk of money to a college which bears his name today. Another person is going to do that in Tennessee, a guy called Vanderbilt. So the Central Pacific has different problems. The big problem they have is that at the beginning of their work, right after the Civil War, they lose pretty much all their labor force. Silver discoveries in the Rocky Mountain states meant that a lot of people left to try their hand at being miners because that was more lucrative work. People could make more money being miners. The problem was solved when the Central Pacific actually hired Chinese workers. There was a small group of Chinese workers who had been living in the United States ever since the gold rush in the late 1850s. I'm sorry, in the late 1840s and the early 1850s. And this very small group of Chinese workers had just kind of been hanging around, doing various nondescript jobs, and they were hired by the Central Pacific, and they proved to be really good workers. They worked really hard. You could pay them about half as much as a regular white worker. They were healthier than white workers because they drank tea, and when they made their tea, they boiled the water. And they were completely disposable. And that sounds callous and it sounds cold, but the thinking at the time was these people were worthless. And what happened is the Central Pacific is actually going to send agents to China and recruit more Chinese migrants to work for them. On May 10th of 1869, the two lines met in Promontory Point, Utah. Golden spikes were driven into the track to celebrate. They were immediately taken out, and the heads of both companies would take that money, the golden spikes. In case you're wondering, that is our book, and that is the scene on the front of your history book. The meeting of the two lines. The Chinese workers, I ask you to take a look at the front of your book. And if you can find a Chinese worker there, then you're a better man than I, because the Chinese workers were not allowed to be in this picture. And they were all fired by the Central Pacific right after this. And they are going to be hated in the 1800s, late 1800s, out west. So to sum up, the railroads out west, and particularly the transcontinental railroads, had really some big impacts on the west. Number one, it's going to lead to the settlement of the west. It's going to enable the settlement of the west. Number two, it's going to have a really interesting relationship with industry. In some cases, it encouraged industry. In some cases, industry encourages the railroad, if you like. And last but not least, there's definitely a link between railroads and Native Americans, as you can see in the table. So the third point would be the destruction of the Great Plains way of life. One of the things when we're building the railroad, there's thousands of workers, they need to be fed, and the railroad companies are going to shoot buffalo, and especially the Union Pacific, they're going to shoot buffalo and feed their workers these buffalo. Alright, so we're going to look at some different types of Western settlers, 3 types of Western settlers. We'll start with farmers. We'll start with miners. The basic pattern is this. There would be some kind of strike, whether it was gold, whether it was silver, copper, iron, lead. Then there would be a rush. The most famous one, of course, was the 1849 gold rush out west. People would come after the initial prospectors had come. Big companies would come in and set up big corporations and mining operations. In some cases, towns would spring up overnight, and sometimes the towns would spring up overnight and then disappear. One of the most infamous would be Virginia City, which was founded in 1862, and it didn't last very long. There are some pros and some cons of the miners. The pros would be that it is going to lead to the settlement of the Rocky Mountain states. Another pro would be we're adding gold and silver into the economy, and in this we're going to talk a lot about money in this unit. And so adding gold and silver into the economy basically adds money right into the economy. The cons there's a whole bunch. There's a boom and bust cycle. We have towns spring up overnight. Sometimes they disappear and become ghost towns. Native American lands are highly sought for, especially if those Native Americans are on gold or some other precious resource. The most infamous example would be the Black Hills of South Dakota, where the Sioux are basically kicked off their ancient burial grounds because there's gold there. And the last con would be the environmental impact of mining. Americans had very little understanding of this, and we're basically going to be cutting into mountains and leaving huge holes and terrible eyesores. And in the late 1800s, some people are going to be very aware of this and want to change things. Second group, and you might not associate these guys with railroads, are the cowboys. The origins of cowboys are actually in South America. A lot of words that we associate with cowboys, for example, lasso, are Spanish in origin. And the first cowboys were kind of born on the flatlands, the plains of Argentina and countries like that in South America. In the United States, they originate in Texas. And what you have are some enterprising people who use the technology of the time with some of the realities of the time. So we have farmers in Texas had over a long time period had kind of bred a breed of cattle that was very hardy and could survive without much water. And the first guy to really exploit this is a guy called Joseph McCoy. He is going to take Texas Longhorn, drive them north, and he's going to drive them to a town called Abilene. He builds a stockyard in Abilene, and the cattle are going to be slaughtered and transported east, where they'll be processed in factories in places like Chicago and Illinois. So the job of a cowboy, when I was a kid, I always thought a cowboy's job was like some kind of detective. And I always thought that cowboys, their job was to kind of chase Indians around and solve crimes. The job of a cowboy was much more mundane and far less interesting. And really the image that we have of cowboys comes from Hollywood, and it also comes from very exaggerated pulp fiction of the late 1800s. So the job of cowboys was to round up cattle in Texas, and this cattle was free roaming. It would be branded, it would be marked so farmers could differentiate their cattle. Cowboys' job would be to round up the cattle and drive the cattle north on one of the 4 trails, and drive the cattle north to one of the so-called cow towns. And upon successful completion of that job, they would get paid, and the cattle would then be transported in trains along railroads to the east. This happened for about 20 years, the golden era of cowboys, and the golden era of cowboys slams shut in 1887. In 1887, it was an incredibly cold winter, and a whole bunch of Texas Longhorn died out. And what we have is a whole bunch of people decide that rather than drive the cattle north the way they have been doing, people are going to build ranches, and farmers built ranches kind of along the south here, all the way across these cattle trails, and they're going to fence off their ranches with barbed wire. And that is going to mean an end to the cowboy era, and cowboys are going to become ranch hands. Last but by no means least, we talk about farmers. And the farmers are the beneficiaries of the Homestead Act. And they also understand that there's a close link between them and railroads. And that's a little kind of cartoon drawing of a farmer out west. A lot of farmers, their first house would look like this. They would build their house into the side of hills. They were called sodbusters. Farming in the Great Plains was incredibly difficult, and the farmers are able to farm in the Great Plains thanks to technological breakthroughs. Things like the steel plow, the mechanical reaper, seed drills, All of these allow far greater production. They also allow the hard, baked soil of the Great Plains to be cultivated. And what we're going to see is this area is going to become the new breadbasket of the nation. And there's some pros and cons. The pros are that we're going to see more Western settlement. This area becomes the breadbasket. Cons are going to be, again, clashes with Native Americans. And farmers are going to really struggle because technology enables them to produce more and more crops. And one of the things that's going to happen is this technology is expensive, and in the later 1800s, they're producing more and more, the technology is costing more and more, and they're making less money. And so farmers are really going to struggle. And the other thing to factor in here are the railroads. So the only way farmers can get their crops to market is through the railroads. So the railroads and farmers are going to clash quite sometimes violently in the late 1800s. And these are just pictures of some of the technological advances. Mechanical reapers and threshers. Now, modern farming machines kind of combine these separate machines into one.